In 2004, brothers Mark and Eric, along with Eric's girlfriend Jessica, went ice fishing and snowmobiling in Western Ontario. That weekend triggered a deep fear of the unknown as well as a large curiosity as well. But before we get into their encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share, please email it to me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading multiple times every week. So don't forget to take that subscribe button with you while you follow the tracks into the woods so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Today's encounter comes from Mark and Eric, and it happened in 2004 out at their parents' cabin in Engineers Lake in Western Ontario. Engineers Lake is located in between the Manitoba-Ontario border and the small town of Kenora, Ontario. It's located right in the heart of the Canadian Shield, an area absolutely teeming with lakes, rivers, dense forest. It's a snowmobilers and anglers and hunters' paradise. Both Mark and Eric were avid snowmobilers as well as avid hardwater anglers. They had asked their dad if they could go out to the family cabin for a few days, and their dad had no problem with that whatsoever. So on the Thursday night, Mark and Eric, along with Eric's girlfriend Jessica, they made their way from Steinbach all the way out to Engineers Lake. They got out there, it was around 9 o'clock, and inside the cottage was absolutely freezing. It was minus 31 degrees Celsius inside the cabin. So the first thing Mark did was he got a fire going, and then him and Eric went out back to go gather more wood for the night. They had been outside for about 10 minutes, and Jessica came outside and asked them if one of them had been tapping on the outside of the cottage. Both Mark and Eric kind of looked at each other, looked back at her and said, no, like we've been back here the entire time. So then Eric asked Jessica whereabouts this tapping was coming from. And she told him it was on the opposite side of the cabin, right underneath the bedroom window where they would be sleeping. So Eric walked around the outside of the cabin, walked up beside it, walked to where that bedroom window was, and he noticed that there was a bunch of footprints in the snow leading out of the woods, up to the cabin, turning and then going back into the woods. It had been snowing super hard all day, and it was still snowing really hard at this point as well. So when Eric looked at those tracks, he could tell that they were super fresh. And his first thought was that they were from somebody trying to case the cabin in hopes to break into it later if nobody was there. Because they had some problems in the past over the winter with their cottage getting broken into, because there's hardly anybody out there that time of year. So it's a perfect opportunity for criminals to break into the cabins because there's hardly anybody around. So he turned, looked at the bush, and he just yelled, "Whoever you are, screw off, leave us alone." And then he turned around and he walked back to Mark. When he got back to Mark, they gathered up the rest of the wood and they went inside. For the rest of the night, the three of them, they just kept that fire going, and they stayed up till about 2 in the morning playing cards before they decided that was it and they were going to call it a night. Shortly before 5 in the morning, Eric woke up because he had to use the washroom. So he got up, he went to use the washroom, and when he was coming back into the bedroom, he heard that same tapping that Jessica had heard earlier coming from right below the bedroom window. So he quickly walked over to the bed, got up on it, and he looked out the window to see if he could find out who was making this tapping. So he looked out the window and he did not see anybody, but he saw fresh tracks leading away from the cabin into the woods. So his first thought was, this guy's back. So he quickly went and got Mark, woke him up and said, "Hey Mark, this guy's back, let's go get him." So Mark and Eric both quickly got dressed, they grabbed a couple of flashlights, and they headed out the back door of the cabin. Once they were outside, they walked along the side of the cabin, turned, and they walked up to where that bedroom window was. And sure enough, there were fresh prints in the snow. So they turned and they followed those prints into the woods. They followed them for about 100 yards into the forest, when all of a sudden behind them, about 25 yards back, they could hear cracking in the woods. So they stopped, they quickly turned around, they're shining their flashlights, but they didn't see anything. So they decided they were going to turn around and they were going to head back towards the cabin and try to catch up with this guy. So they started making their way to where that cracking had come from. And when they got to where that cracking had been, there was nobody there. They spent a couple of seconds panning the area with their flashlights and they didn't see anything. Then Mark happened to look down and he noticed something odd about these tracks. These tracks were absolutely huge. They were way bigger than his foot. He figured that these tracks were about 18 inches long and pretty wide as well. So they're looking down at these tracks, and Mark instantly said, "Let's get back to the cabin." So they started running towards the cabin through the woods. When they were about 20 yards from the wood line, all of a sudden they heard Jessica scream from inside the cabin. Hearing that, they just sprinted right back for the cabin. When they broke the wood line, they didn't see anybody there, so they just ran directly towards the back door that they had come out of. As they were running there, though, they noticed that there was a set of tracks that ran along the side of the cabin and into the woods in behind the cabin. They actually had to run over these tracks to get back into the cottage itself. As soon as they got in, Jessica ran up to Eric and said, "We have to go, let's go, can we please go?" And they did not hesitate. Mark quickly grabbed his keys and the three of them made their way to the truck and they took off. On their drive home, Eric asked Jessica what had happened, and Jessica said she woke up and Eric was not in bed. So she got up, she turned the light on, stepped out of the bedroom to look into the living room to see if he was there. When all of a sudden she heard this loud thud on the side of the cabin just below that bedroom window. So she turned, she jumped up onto the bed, the same bed Eric had stood on to look out the window before. And when she looked out that window, she saw this large, 10-foot tall, completely covered in hair bipedal creature running along the side of the cabin into the woods in behind it. And she said that's when she screamed. Mark thought this was a perfect opportunity now to tell her about those tracks they found. But once he started to tell her about them, Eric completely cut him off because Eric could tell that it was just too hard on her at that point. It was just still too fresh. She was still shaking and she was just completely pale. So Eric said, "You know what, Mark, we'll talk about this later. Let's just leave it alone for now." So they kept driving all the way back to Steinbach. Once they were just outside of Steinbach, Mark and Eric started to talk again, and they decided that once they dropped Jessica off, they were going to go back out to the cabin with a rifle and with a camera and try to see if they can either get this thing or at least get a picture of it or its tracks. So once they dropped Jessica off at home, they stopped at their parents' place, they grabbed a rifle, Eric grabbed his camera, and they made their drive all the way back out to Engineers Lake. Now, they did not get back out there till about 11:30 because the roads were just absolutely horrible from snowing for almost 2 days straight at this point. So it took them a long time to get back. Once they got back out to the cabin, Mark grabbed his rifle, Eric grabbed the camera, and they went straight to where that bedroom window was. When they got to that bedroom window, unfortunately, those tracks that had been fresh earlier were completely filled in and blown over with snow. So at this point, they decided, you know what, let's hop on our sleds and let's go drive along the shoreline and see if we can find any sign of this creature. So they jumped on their snowmobiles and they spent the rest of the day going along the shoreline of Engineer Lake and Winnetack Lake as well, which is located just north. The two lakes actually connect together. So they spent the entire day going all along the shorelines trying to find any sign whatsoever of this thing, and they didn't find any at all. Now, even though they were super curious about trying to find this thing and trying to get a picture of it, once it started to get dark, they started to feel really uneasy and they decided, you know what, we're not going to stay here tonight. We're just going to head home. So they headed back to the cabin. They loaded their snowmobiles up on the trailer, hooked the trailer up to the truck, and they started heading back up to the highway. When they got up to the highway, there was actually a Treaty 3 police SUV blocking the road right in front of them. Treaty 3 Police is a First Nations police force. They look after all the First Nations as well as assisting the OPP in Western Ontario. So when they saw this vehicle in front of them, they knew exactly who this was. So they slowed down and the officer got out of the SUV and he actually walked right up to Mark's window. Mark rolled his window down and this officer told him that the roads going towards the Manitoba border were absolutely horrible, and he said if you're going to be driving, you have to drive really slow. He said those roads were not good. At this point, Eric turned and looked at the officer and he asked him if they had any reports of a large hairy guy harassing cottagers in the area. This officer said, "No, we haven't had any reports on that." He said, "But Sabe, as my people call them, they're very curious." He said sometimes they'll peek from behind trees or they'll look through windows. And then the officer stopped and he didn't say anything else. So Mark and Eric just kind of looked at this officer. The officer said, "Drive safe," walked back up to his SUV, got in it, backed up, and let them pass. They drove really slow the whole rest of the way home, and they were a little bit confused by what this officer had said to them. Now, this whole experience sparked a huge curiosity for them, especially what that officer said. So as soon as they got home, they looked into it. It did not take them very long to discover what that officer meant by Sabe. And ever since then, both Mark and Eric have been back out to that cabin several times and other places as well, trying to find this Sasquatch or a Sasquatch to try to more or less kind of give themselves closure for what happened that day. And they have said that what that officer told them about them being curious is completely accurate to their knowledge. And their recommendations are, though, if you're ever anywhere and you happen to see a set of tracks going into the woods, do not follow it. They said just show these creatures respect and hopefully they'll show you respect back. Well, that's it for today's encounter. As always, thanks for joining us. And if you have any comments on this, please leave it below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And if you haven't done so already, please don't forget to take that subscribe button with you while you follow tracks into the woods. And I'll see you next time.